Colin, I'm not sure if you are talking, but we cannot hear you. And if you're not, we're just kind of waiting patiently and you take your time. I just wanted to make sure you were aware.
Hey,
Hi,
did you all hear anything I said just now?
we heard nothing. Sorry, sir.
Oh my goodness gracious. I'm so sorry. I was talking all this time and I'm like, nobody was in the chat saying anything. Um, okay. Sorry about that. How come nobody said you couldn't hear me? Did you text me?
I told you through the microphone that we couldn't hear you and you were muted.
Uh,
I was like, can you hear me? I'm
I
sorry,
couldn't hear
sir.
you. I couldn't hear you in the microphone either. I'm sorry, but it's all good. I'm glad y'all stuck around, just looking at my facial expressions being all animated and whatnot. But wish I would have helped the brother out. But it's all good. We're gonna be good. We're gonna make it happen anyway. We're gonna go back, and what I'll do is I'll just kind of accelerate what I was doing just now so that we can stay on time and be all right. But thank you for kind of hanging in there. What I was just getting into, and I'll just start here essentially. Okay. Well, I'll start at the beginning just so that we're all at the same space. The conversation around leaving genius on the table. And for those of you that are not already doing so, if you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram at Colin E. Seal or Colin Seal, you can do that. But this is kind of a follow up to what I did the other day for those of you that were there for that conversation. Because identification is one part of the puzzle, but it's another part of the puzzle where we start talking about what education means and we say these things like all kids need this and like we need to make sure all kids get an excellent education. And what I actually got trapped into is this idea of we need to make sure we release the full potential of all students. And I started realizing this was a funky statement. Because when it comes to full potential, I'm going to tell you something. It's not your job to tell me what the full potential of my kids are. That's up to them. The world is their oyster. Full potential is such a fixed concept that I'm not really with that. I'm not going to be a part of this. I'm not going to condone this. All right. So now I want to go back to this other part of it where it's not just full potential, but it's all students. All students? I don't know about all because all makes me get into this one size fits all mentality. All leads me to this idea of really thinking through this imaginary middle person, this middle child, this middle student. I don't want to think about all. I want to think, if I want to create a world where we're not leaving genius on the table, what would it look like to transition from all children to each child? And if I think about each child, I look back at this elementary school classroom that I was in, where what pains me to this day is the fact that 3 kids did not finish high school. And this mattered because there were only 12 kids per grade level in this school that we were bused to be a part of this gifted program. So if we're being bused to this school, we're a part of this program. We're academically elite. And 3 of us don't even finish high school. And I was so close to being a 4th, we've got some problems at hand. So today, this is what we're going to break down. I'm going to break down this idea that my experience growing up gifted in Brooklyn, New York, was not an anomaly, but it's actually part of a huge issue that affects a lot of kids in gifted education, advanced academics. And I want to give you practical tools to deal with this in your classrooms, in your school buildings, to make sure that we don't leave genius on the table. Because at the end of the day, we need that bulb to go on. We don't want to be dealing with this constant crisis around underachievement. So let me tell you something real quick. Let me kind of set the stage for you. There was this thing where a group of scholars started to ask, you know what? We spent a lot of time talking about achievement gaps and different issues coming to achievement. One question they didn't know the answer to was, how many kids are actually ahead? Like, how many kids are sitting in classrooms right now where they're actually like ahead a grade level? What percent? Go ahead and throw it in the chat. What percent of kids do you think are actually above grade level in like grades 3 through 8? What percent of kids are above grade level? 18, 20, 15, 15. Nobody said $1 because it's not Price is Right. Good. So we're taking this seriously today. Awesome. So here we are, and we're talking about where this is at. And some of the numbers are interesting because they're kind of right there in the range. You got 20 to 40% of your elementary, middle school kids being at least one grade level. 11 to 30 in math. When you start looking at who's 4 grade levels ahead, so fourth graders at the 8th grade level, up to 10% of kids in 4th grade are already reading 4 grades ahead of the level. You might notice the disparities between reading and math, and that might make sense because it's pretty easy to just tell a kid to get a more advanced book. It's not as easy to ask a 4th grade teacher to teach 8th grade math. But here's the funky part. We talk about gifted education as this thing, maybe for like 10% of kids. But in reality, we've got kids that are advanced academically at levels well beyond what we identify in our gifted programming. Even when you start factoring special considerations and all that, like nobody is putting 40% of kids in their gifted program. So I want to dig into this a little bit more. Because when you start talking about leaving genius on the table, here's the secret. These numbers are not staying there. Our kids who are achieving at high levels in elementary school are dropping off. And you know where the drop-offs are happening? Low SES, race. So we're seeing more likelihoods of kids like the ones I went to school with, not graduating from school, not going to selective colleges, not graduating from college once they get there, not having meaningful outcomes in life after they finish college. So what this looks like is I've got a kid that I went to middle school with in my gifted program who right after high school barely graduated, and he's a Marine to this day. Nothing wrong with being a Marine. It's great. I got another friend who works at like the T-Mobile store in the mall in my old neighborhood. Nothing wrong with working at the T-Mobile store. But there is something wrong with leaving genius on the table. Because this kid was voted most likely to succeed when I was in 8th grade. This kid could have invented the next big thing. So we're suffering as a society because of the way that we're leaving genius on the table. And I started realizing there's some issues here that play into this. And I know y'all have been talking a lot during this conference, during these sets of workshops around the myths around giftedness. But what I realized is like being gifted is one thing. Being gifted in Black, being gifted in brown, being gifted in poor is another thing. Because my intensity is threatening to some adults, even when I was in 3rd and 4th grade. The idea of me having abstract thinking can be a challenge for a lot of folks as well. So this high achieving gifted learner isn't something that I should look at in a race neutral context. Because gifted behaviors for a lot of the groups historically underrepresented look a little bit different. And I want to be clear with you all about something. The way that you're dealt with as a child whose needs are not being met are real funky. Because what do we do when kids, when they finish early? They finish their work early. So what do you ask them to do? Often we say, hey, Just go get a book to read. All right. Any other things? Like what else is in the universe of nonsense that they ask kids to do when they finish early? So go read a book. What else can you do? You could do more work. Good luck with that, right? Go do more work. Help your classmates. And here's the thing that gets so crazy, right? Like, not just help your classmates, but help the teacher. Do y'all remember it used to be like a bonus to be able to clean the chalkboard? I don't know what level of disgusting bacteria was in that gross sponge, but you felt like you were winning at life if you got to have that gross sponge and put those things out on the chalkboard. And yeah, they ask you to go help your peers. And I'm always like, if I know the material enough to teach it to my classmates, why exactly am I here? Why isn't it an issue of social justice that every child should be challenged every day? Don't I deserve that? And then here's the part that really gets me. I was with this program for a long time. When I was in 8th grade, like I was the prototypical 8th grader. National Honor Society. I was double accelerated in math. I was double accelerated in English. I was part of any committee. My school was, in a poor neighborhood in Brooklyn. So I was like the literal dog and pony show. I was the dog and the pony. Whenever something was going on in my school, I was the speaker. I was that kid. Then all of a sudden, just like these kids in my class, just like these kids who didn't finish school and had a lot of issues in high school, I became the same exact kid. I went to a high school called the Bronx High School of Science. And what's interesting is when I look back at these pictures from my freshman and sophomore year of high school, like every single picture, I look exactly the same. I wasn't a rapper. I wasn't like appearing on a rap album cover. This was just what I did. This is how I felt. This is what my life was all about. Because I went to a high school where it wasn't a school for gifted kids. It was a school for high achievers. So at this school, what they did is they did harder, faster, more. Y'all know something about that? Do y'all know some teachers that hear gifted and think harder, faster, more? And the reality is, I'm not going to do it. Like, if you know me the way I know me, you need to know I'm not going to do it. In the Thinking Like a Lawyer book, I tell a story about 9th grade. This teacher sent us home to go watch Gandhi. Back in the day, the VHS, that was a 2 VHS set. You want me to go watch Gandhi and answer 35 questions about Gandhi? Guess who's not doing that homework? That's a simple answer. No way. No way am I going to sit there watching Gandhi. Are you crazy, lady? But I want to give a little bit more context to this a little bit later, and as to why my story about leaving Genius on the table isn't just unique to me. So how do we turn the light bulb on? How do we make sure that we're not getting to this point? Let's look backwards. It's hard to not look backwards, because these have been issues for a long time. W.B. Du Bois, while not everyone agrees with his mindset around the talented 10, I thought it was interesting because 10% is typically the number we talk about when it comes to local norms, right? So like I always think about this idea of like 10% around what would happen if we poured in to the talented 10 in such a way that also reminded them that there's a responsibility that comes with being in that top 10%. To be the leaders, to be the missionaries, to be able to actually bring up their own people. There's notions of what goes on here around the story of underachievement around gifted Black kids, gifted kids of color, that Donna Ford has been talking about for forever, since the 90s. There's a scholar here at Arizona State University, colleague of my wife, Juan Carrillo, who talks about what this looks like for Latino males. Very interesting perspective of how this concept of like being a nerd in a barrio plays out. But what I want us to start to do is recognize that leaving Genius on the table is a symptom. Kids like me having 80 absences in freshman year, kids like the ones I went to school with dropping out, it's a system. Those are symptoms. But if we start asking why, we can get down to the root cause of what's making this go. And when I group these things together, there's 3 areas we're going to talk about. We're going to talk heavy on the cultural part, not so heavy on the psychological part, and we're going to break down the social part as the biggest takeaway of today's conversation. All right? That's what we're doing as part of this. So I want to look at this, and this is usually a group activity we spend a lot of time on. We don't have as much time today, so I want to make sure that we do this without taking up too much time. So there's 2 islands, and they're separated by a body of water. Keep track of the characters here, right? There was a ferry that traveled between the islands once a week. One island, there was Nin. On the other island, there was Zug. And then one week, Nin and Zug met on a ferry, and let me tell you, it was love. They didn't have any way to get there, so they met each other every week on the ferry. And then one day, Zug said, listen, this long-term relationship is just too hard. I can't handle it. It's over. Nin was devastated, got off the boat, and she got off the docks, and she was crying. Then Goo comes, right? So we got Nin, we got Zug, and now we got Goo. And Goo said, what's wrong? Nin told the story and said, huh. And then the Goo replied, it's okay. I'll take you across to the other island, but there's one condition. You have to spend the evening with me. And then thought about it and said, all right, I'll do it. The next morning, Nin and Goo set off for the other island, but news travels faster than Goo's boat. And Zug heard about Nin's decision before they arrived and was waiting on the shore when the boat got there. Zug said, Nin, you have been unfaithful. Leave. Again, Nin was devastated, sat on the shore and cried. And then Yak comes along, asked what was wrong. Nin said the story. Yak got really mad, stormed off, and beat Zug to a pulp. So, Nin, Zug, Goo, and Yak. Out of those 4, which one is the best? Which one is the worst? Come up with your list and just put it in order, all right? Like Nin, Zug, Goo, Yak, in order from like least to greatest. Throw it in the chat so we can get some sort of ideas of where we're going. And sometimes it's easier to just start with this one. Who is the worst? Go ahead in the chat and let me know, who do y'all think is the absolute worst out of everyone that we have here so far? Who stinks? Who is hot garbage? Who is just terrible at life? We don't want these people around. They just stink. So some of y'all got problems with Zug. A lot of Zug haters, y'all like, yeah, y'all just gonna fight somebody just like that? Man, that's so violent and just bad. Least to greatest. Natalie already got it figured out. Yak, Zug, Goo, and Nin. All right. So, like, how about this? How about some justification for who is the worst? Why do y'all think the person that you identified as the worst is the worst? And on the other hand, those of you that find someone you think is the best, why do you think that person is the best? Stephanie says they're all terrible. All right. So, like, that's life. A lot of times, most of y'all stink, but maybe one of y'all stink less. Some of y'all think Zug was a beast. Zug made assumptions. Okay. Zug made assumptions. So Zug he kind of heard from so-and-so through the grapevine. All right. Zug was selfish and demanding. Some people would say that Zug was a good communicator who expressed it, whatever Zug's needs were. So Goo took advantage of the situation. Yak had no interest. He just wanted to, Yak just fight it. So, question. Did y'all assign genders to this? Because there's no gender that's listed. Did any of you assign genders to this problem? Did you assume that, like, Nin was a woman? Because Nin was irrationally crying over and over again and seemed like a hot mess? And it's always interesting, right? Because most of the rooms that I'm in is majority women. And it's so interesting that most of the time, women look at this and blindly start being like, man, Nin is so much drama. I got a friend just like Nin, always tripping over some dude. And I'm like, all right. But, like, what's going on there? And even when it comes to this idea around whether Yak was the worst, because some people like Yak. They look at like Yak like had somebody's back. Some people like Nin are like, hey, you know what? Like, or Goo, like, Well, you don't get stuff for free. And then look at y'all. Y'all are the ones that are in the gutter. Spending the evening with me might just be like, hey, I'm like leaving really early in the morning. So like you got to come spend the evening with me. So I don't have to wait. Y'all are the ones that could be nasty about it. Ain't nothing nasty happening here. So like as we start thinking through this, I want to ask you a different question. Why am I even talking about this? Within the context of leaving genius on a table, within the context of underachievement and trying to reverse underachievement. Why am I talking about this? Any predictions, thoughts, concerns? Why did I ask you to do these rankings? So implicit bias, Michelle, I'm going to take that comment and I'm going to ask us to be honest with ourselves. Implicit bias is a garbage term in my opinion. The reason I think it's a garbage term is we say it to make people feel nice. I don't think it's implicit bias. I think that the reasons that we say that Nin is a woman in this case and we assign gender without thinking about it, even the way that we assign people from best to worst, it is totally explicit bias. We know exactly what we are thinking. We know exactly how we feel. And the impact of it is a real impact. So implicit makes it seem like it's some subconscious, I didn't know it was happening sort of deal. I need you to own it. The same way that I need to own that as a teacher, I was explicitly biased against Black boys in my classroom. I was much more harsh on discipline when it came to Black boys in my classroom. Hear me out for a second. I knew the world was harsh for Black boys. And I felt this really insane need to over-prepare them for that harshness. That was explicit bias. I needed to name that and own that in order to change that. So we start thinking about stereotypes, we start thinking about how we characterize student motivation, student engagement. Oh, this kid isn't engaged, this kid isn't motivated. But in what way do my explicit biases prevent me from seeing their motivation, their engagement from anything other than my lens? So let's be real. We are on two different islands when it comes to our kids in a lot of ways. Let's make sure that we're aware of the cultural things that play out that limit achievement. So a lot of people think about culture and they talk about this iceberg theory of culture. Like for instance, some of y'all have seen me a few times. Some of you have read the book. Some of you were there on Monday and heard me speak. What do you all know about me right now? Those of you that are just meeting me for the first time today, for the first time on Monday, what do you know about me? What are all the conclusions you can make about me just by our interactions thus far? What do you know about me? I'm an amazing public speaker. I'm a dad, dedicated father from Brooklyn. Brooklyn represent all day, every day. Highly intelligent. I need to cut and paste this and send this to my wife. I'm going to send all this to my wife. Make sure she knows what's up. Former teacher and lawyer, driven, goal-oriented. Interesting, right? Driven, goal-oriented. I didn't say that, but you're making assumptions around that. You know, I'm funny. I'm brave. Like I haven't really done a whole lot courageous right now. Maybe in your mind you did, but I don't see anything I've done so far as brave. But here we are. There are things on the surface side of there. Is there anything else you know about me, maybe culturally? Anything you know about me in terms of like my identity based off of what you look at? So I mentioned that I was from Barbados. I'm a Black man, right? So there's this idea that like, although I'm a Black man, born in the United States of America, I've got this ancestry that's different, right? So we start realizing all these things that are there on the surface. Maybe if I was a student in the class and you saw the way I dressed, if you saw the holidays that I celebrated, if you saw my parents and saw what they interacted, you'll get all these things on the surface. But below the iceberg, there's always so much more. And some of the things that really stand out here are like things that sort of blew my mind when I first started teaching. When I taught in DC, like on the surface, I'm teaching all these Black kids. And I remember I had this kid, Samuel, who got a 92 on a first test, a 22 on a second test. So I call his dad, and I'm like, yo, what is going on with Samuel? Why did he do so bad in this test? Like, he did so well in the first one. He's like, this happens every year at the start of the year. He was from Senegal. And he was like, in my family and in our culture, you don't really speak to adults unless you're spoken to first. I tell Sam that doesn't apply in school, but every year when the school year starts, we've got to have to reteach him to make sure that he speaks up and asks questions of adults. And I thought, literally, here I am in this middle school with a lot of the Black boys being off the chain, always got something to say, always speaking up. It never would have occurred to me that like Sam had this invisible aspect of his culture where he wasn't going to speak to me unless I asked him a question first. Expectations around space, right? Like there's a principal that told me she got cursed out one time real bad because a parent was in the wrong area in the carpool, and she like tapped on her window, and she came out and just lost it on her. Don't you be tapping on my window, whatever happened. It's like, all right, like, because you don't necessarily know. It might not mean anything to you, but there's difference around space, around etiquette, around how much I care about time, how much I value body language, right? I'm a big like, but I don't say yes. I don't say I'm going to do that right now. I'm a big nodder. That's what I do. I'm a thought processor who just pauses in the middle of talking. Who you ask me a question, I'm going to just sit there. You'd be like, hello, Earth to Colin. I'm like, yo, like, why are you being rude? Like, I'm thinking about it, but you don't know these things. And what I need you to understand is there a whole iceberg of categories and characteristics and backgrounds of your students that you just don't know. It's okay not to know it, but don't act like what you see is enough. All right. So with this said, I want to go back to this other part around leaving genius on the table, around my personal issues there, and how I spent a lot of my life blaming myself for being an underachiever, being a slacker. I used to actually say all the time, like, man, I was just such a slacker. I stopped caring, blah, blah, blah. And about 4 years ago, I started reading more about issues around underachievement. And this was a book about underachievement for kids in gifted education. And there's like this whole diagram in the book where they drew different caricatures of different ways that people underachieve. Y'all notice anything about these caricatures? Kind of interesting who these people are, what they look like. And I started recognizing that, like, maybe it's not just me. And then I had an experience where there's a good friend of mine who is a cabinet level official at her district here in Phoenix. She's a Latina. And she has this certificate in her office. And it blew my mind. I'm like, what does that say? And it turns out that when she was in 4th grade, she was in a really elite gifted program here in Arizona. And they were giving out awards to kids at the end of the year, best at math, most likely to succeed, all these different awards. And everyone in class signed these awards and passed it out in this public ceremony. Her award was for asking the most and stupidest questions. And when I see this, I wonder if we really understand what it means when I ask, is it safe to be Black and gifted at the same time? To be brown and gifted at the same time? To be poor and gifted at the same time? Because it's not always safe. And we start recognizing that, like, when the teacher was looking at Erica, they weren't looking at her as a future leader of a district who gets paid to ask tons and tons of probing questions about data, about student performance, about student discipline. They see her asking as defiance. They see her asking as questioning her authority. Maybe we're not giving our kids certificates that are this bold, but there's other ways that we are signaling that they don't belong. So I face this in particular because of this extra challenge of only being diagnosed with ADHD at 37 years old. So all throughout my experience, like, it always pained me to the core that Here I am at this school where the only criteria to get in is to pass the test. And I passed the test. I'm sitting in the same exact school where like Neil deGrasse Tyson graduated from, 9 Nobel Prize winners graduated from, and I am not doing a single homework assignment for months at a time. Why is it so easy to just leave me there as a struggling Black student and say, whatever, he's lazy. Colin's a hot mess. Colin's disorganized. I didn't even need a diagnosis of ADHD to get someone to help me. And this is why I think it's just so important to transition from all children to each child. Because I was a child who needed your help. I was a child who needed that attention, that support. So like, there was a lot going on beyond the iceberg. I need you to care to look beyond the iceberg, look beyond the surface. So what does this mean? Sometimes we overthink things a lot. Okay, cultural responsive teaching is something I think we overlook, we overdo a lot. And what I really think about when it comes to this is something like this one. We struggle to teach critical thinking when it comes to English learners. We struggle to teach critical thinking to kids when they're too low. There's all these different things we say, but the reality is, FYI, does anybody here from South Africa and happen to randomly speak Afrikaans? No? Didn't really think so. But let's just do this real quick to make sure we understand why I think that critical thinking in language, critical thinking in academic content need not be an either or proposition. What do we think that first one means in English? Hello. What does that mean? Any guesses in the chat? Okay. Fairly easy to guess. Hello. What about that next one? That one is a little funkier.
You go to school?
Do you like school? I love school, actually. What about that next one? Rigor, relevancy, which probably know what that is, and then verhoudings. Sure, that's not how you pronounce it, but like that's what it looks like to me in English. Any idea of what that is?
Relationships.
Relationships, right? And how'd you get that? Who said that? And how'd you get that?
Because it's training from years and years ago. It was part of our training as teachers.
So it's a thing, right? You made a connection. Like, I remember learning about the 3 R's, rigor, relevance, relationship. So I'm going to go ahead and make that connection. Guamore is good morning. Summer is wonderful. At least it was while it lasted, and it seems like it's already done. But here we are. We don't speak Afrikaans, and in 30 seconds, we were able to engage in a lot of critical thinking, patterns, looking at different pieces of words and reminding ourselves of like, what they might have meant, making predictions and inferences. So like, this is here. I know that we can do our reframing, right? Like English language learners are really emerging bilinguals. Kids that are like low and struggling academically, they're learning how to learn, which we know is part of leveling up. So as we think about this idea that critical thinking is an important part of what our kids need anyhow, I need to make sure we step back and understand that leaving genius on the table is not just about this idea that our kids are going to get a good job and get a college degree. It's they've got to solve problems that we have never faced before as a society. And I want to be clear. The reason that culturally responsive education matters, the reason that I talk about the educational equity equation, where it's not just enough for our kids to learn how to navigate the system, but to question the system, to break down the system, and to build a new one, is that what we've been doing doesn't really work. When we act like the definition of success is to move our kids along a pathway that brings them closer into more proximity of like whiteness as the norm, using those norms to define their success, their achievement, our society is actually missing out on a broader set of ideas, a broader situation of constructs. Pedro Nogueira says this all the time. And I want you to think about this for a second. People ask all the time, like you talk about inequity in education in terms of discipline. In fact, I actually heard one of your board members put this in one of the meetings before, where she was like, we talk about disproportionate discipline as if like it's our fault if kids are like choking out, if Black kids are more likely to choke out another Black kid on the bus. But like nobody talks about disproportionality when it comes to all the Black kids on a baseball team, on a basketball team. And I'm like, all right, let's talk basketball for a second. Because there are a lot of Black people in the NBA, much more percentage-wise than you would see in, our society as a whole. But Pedro Nogueira would point out that, like, Pedro Nogueira is a scholar. I think he's the dean of education now at USC. Pedro Nogueira would say, the thing about a basketball hoop is that in a poor neighborhood, it's 10 feet tall. In a rich neighborhood, it's 10 feet tall. On the East Coast, 10 feet tall. Rural, 10 feet tall. A basketball hoop is a basketball hoop. So when the hoop is the same, then the game is the same. I'm playing the same game. When it comes to our kids and the challenges that we face with systemic racism, let's be clear, we are not playing the same game, which means we've got to be super purposeful in what it looks like to start to break this apart. So when it comes down to this is where this thinking like a lawyer construct comes from. This is where it becomes really important to push our kids beyond the obvious, okay? So, like, I don't necessarily need to go through this whole activity in full to make sure you understand this, but imagine this. I can look at pictures, ask my kids to figure out what the rule is that bring these pictures together, and then add another picture and say, okay, change the rule, modify the rule. And now you're in charge of the art gallery. And you need to decide whether or not these next two pictures come in. Does this picture come in, yes or no? What's a reason that it could come in? What's the reason you would exclude it? How much you have to change the rule if you would include it? Same thing here. A reason it will get in, a reason you wouldn't let it in. What's a reason you would exclude it? Here is something that I'm doing in this point. I'm asking my kids to bring their values, their experience, their judgment to the table. It matters. It's a part of their analysis. It's a part of the learning outcome. You are a part of this. If I'm a teacher doing this activity in middle school, 5 periods a day, I'm going to have 5 different learning experiences because those learning experiences are being shaped by you because you matter. You have a voice. You have value. Culturally responsive teaching is really about recognizing and giving the chance for that kid to show what their culture is, to show how they contribute to the learning space. So as we talk through this, and we go through this space of like what this means, like if I want my kids to think like a lawyer, make a claim, back it up with evidence, look at different perspectives. This painting should get in for this reason. It doesn't get in for that reason. Weigh the consequences. Well, how would I change the rule if this got in? What would this mean for future pictures if this got in? What would the world look like if pictures like this got into a gallery like this one? And then draw a conclusion based off of that analysis. If this is the structure that we're going for, I can do this as a math teacher. I can be teaching prime and composite numbers. And instead of telling you this is a prime number, this is a composite number, I can just give you a list of numbers, tell you what they are, ask my kids to identify the pattern and make guesses on what the rules are. And I can start to unveil that in such a way where it starts to click to my kids in a way that it's going to stick. And I have an example of that in the Thinking Like a Lawyer book that you all are going to get. When I talk about culturally responsive teaching, I want to be clear. It doesn't just mean that you identify text and literature and examples that involve our kids' names. That matters. But my favorite poem ever is Robert Frost's Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. But at the time that I wanted to teach this poem to my kids, I was a math teacher in Las Vegas at a school that was 100% Black. Now, I don't know for a fact that Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening is about a white dude, but I presume that it is. So you got this white dude that's going through this forest full of snow, and I'm sitting here in Las Vegas in the desert, and I've got a problem. I'm not sure how this is going to connect. So what I did is I Pulp Fictionized the content. I started with the ending, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Where is this person at, and have you been there before? Where is this person at, and have you been there before? So all of a sudden, my kids are talking their stories. My kids are going back into their experiences, and they're telling the story of the moment that they were about to quit something but didn't. At the moment, something got really, really hard, but they couldn't. Too many people were depending on them. They made a promise to themselves. They made a promise to somebody else. Now, when we started talking about that level of promise, when we start unveiling the rest of the poem, these lines hit a little bit different. He won't be not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. That's like, not tonight, not right now. You're not gonna get me today. The devil is a lie. Like, not gonna happen. I'm gonna push through this one. The darkest evening of the year, that had more value. There was a child who had just had her dad deported. She was in pre-calculus. She's trying to figure out, I'm college bound. I don't know what I'm gonna do, but I know that I want to go to college. That's the promises I have to keep. So I got to keep my head down, keep pushing. The woods are lovely, dark, and deep. Nobody's going to blame you to quit right now. Nobody's going to, it's a beautiful place to quit. A beautiful time to quit. You are probably a quitter, but you've got promises to keep. So what I want to be clear with you all about is when I talk about not leaving GNS on the table, and the cultural part of that is so much more than like throwing a name Tyrone in a math problem. You got to make sure we give every kid in our classroom a chance to be a part of the learning. We need to make sure that our kids feel like their stories, their value, they explicitly matter. Think about this. There are signals that I send you all throughout today that you all matter. I ask you all the time, what do you think about this? What's your opinion on this? That's what a classroom that's culturally responsive entails, right? So I want to go through this. Again, explicit bias is the thing that I want to be more careful about versus implicit bias, because in a lot of ways, I was explicitly biased in ways that I needed to take ownership of. I want to make sure that I understand ways that I can leverage culture. If you look at Jefferson County, let's make sure that we are thinking about how we diversify gifted and talented programming. In terms of who the teachers are. We know that Black teachers, generally speaking, the research has shown that like they're 3 times more likely to identify Black kids. But it doesn't really happen that often. So how do we do this? How do we get the positive perspectives? How do we communicate high expectations more thoroughly? These are things that we've talked about a little bit in the last session, right? Like there's a story, there's a history here. There's a because, not despite angle for who our kids are and what they do. Okay, so we want to make sure we communicate those high expectations as a part of that long-term narrative. Very quickly, I'm going to go through the psychological part, but I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. The main point here is there's a double consciousness involved when it comes to being a person in an underrepresented population that's part of this gifted program, right? This double consciousness, you're seeing yourself through the eyes of others. I think Lindsay alluded to this the other day, like, oh, like, I'm gonna go to this gifted program, but I'm gonna be away from my friends. What is that going to look like? I'm seeing it from different angles. So what I would recommend for all the counselors that you know, the counselors at your school, I want you to tell them, start the email right now, like, listen, I need you to research the positive racial identity development model so that we can work on this more explicitly from a social emotional context when it comes to our kids. Because what Donna Ford and Dr. Harris's research had showed is that when Black kids in particular grow up with a positive racial identity, they're much more likely to feel comfortable in their identity as a scholar. The two things were connected. When you felt proud of who you were as a person, it's impossible to feel really proud in an intentional way about your identity as a Black person without also being comfortable with the Black scholar identity, because those two things are connected in a way that really matters, all right? So what does this look like? Psychologically, all I can say is that we want to make sure that when we have these conversations, we don't say, hey kids, it's social emotional learning time. No, thank you. It's got to be embedded in what we already do. So in 3 Blind Mice, it could look like, what are the hardships of being a blind mouse? Where are those challenges? Where are the struggles of being a blind mouse? What might be some reasons they're running after the farmer's wife? Maybe they're relying on other senses. Maybe they rely a lot on the sense of smell. Maybe it's not about you, lady. Why's always got to be about you? It's not about you. So as we start thinking about getting this perspective and looking at this from different angles, looking at it from the farmer's wife's perspective, we can get to a point where even in a social emotional context, we can start to address these things. So we want to be careful about how we implement more ethnic studies access so our kids can see themselves and understand their stories. reading more biographies, understanding that their stories are not unique, but a lot of people have overcome struggles for greatness. I love the story of Muggsy Bogues. Muggsy Bogues was 5'3" and he was in the NBA. Now look, 5'3" is short in real life. So to be 5'3" in the NBA is incredible. I read this book 100 times when I was a kid because it inspired me that I can do anything I set my mind to. All right. Make sure our counselors have that exposure and find a way to integrate SEL into your instruction instead of making one more extra thing. So the last thing I want to talk about, and somehow I'm going to do this in 5 minutes and have a chance to still be able to have some questions and answers. Social pressures matter when it comes to certain populations within gifted education. And I don't want to pretend that it doesn't matter, okay? There's a pressure to be average that is felt more depending on who you are racially. So Roland Fryer, who's a scholar, Harvard economist, he started talking about this stigma around acting white in school. Caveat, I don't know what acting white in school was. I didn't go to school with any white kids. Acting white, literally, I don't even know what that would mean. Like, I just don't even know what acting white would have meant. But we understand that, like, this is something that there is a social stigma to some extent. It's not universal, but to some extent. This stigma around acting white and, like, showing your racial, your scholarly identity is different depending on race. So there's two main studies, right, that kind of base the premise for this. The one study looked at this idea of smart to be cool, cool to be smart. And the setup here was they had a school where you could take this SAT class, all right? SAT prep class. But you had to signal whether or not you're going to be making it public that you were taking a class. So in one control group, you didn't have to make it public. In the other control group, you did have to make it public. And what they found was there was a massive drop-off when you had to make it public. So it meant that there was some social pressure around it. But why it mattered was interesting. It mattered because in some cases, it was cool to be smart. I didn't want to sign up because I didn't want to look like I was dumb and I needed the class. But in other cases, it was smart to be cool. Like, I didn't want to sign up and make it look like I cared about school. So we know that the social image actually matters. But in Roland Fryer's study, when he started looking at longitudinal data for one of the biggest longitudinal data sets in education, Black kids with a 4.0 had 1.5 fewer friends than white kids with a 4.0. For our Latinx kids, 4.0 kids were the least popular out of all their students. And they had 3 fewer friends than typical white kids that had a 4.0. Look, at most, I've only had like 4 friends. Like, losing 3 friends, that's a lot of friends. So, like, we start realizing that there's real consequences to this. There's a real social pressure. How do we start to actually dig into this idea, especially with our boys? Because a lot of our boys, and the scholar Richard Majors talks about this idea of cool pose. I've got it under control. I'm not breaking a sweat. I don't want to look like I'm trying too hard. We've got to make sure we think about how to be anti this, which means we've got to make sure we actively engage our kids. We got to make sure that we're super on the spot around, like, pushing and engaging and tapping into our kids, thinking like a lawyer. This idea of connecting learning to justice and fairness is how we go about doing that, right? Like, whether we look at this case where a 5-year-old boy pulled out a chair and his aunt ended up suing him, I don't really care that you know the ins and out of battery. I want my kids to be driven, to think about the aunt's perspective and think about this poor 5-year-old boy who's getting sued and how messed up that is. Because when they think that it's messed up, they can start making inferences and predictions about why this is happening to begin with. Maybe there's family drama. Maybe this kid just has a lot of money. Maybe she really just can't pay, but they're making inferences because they care to. It's fun. It doesn't feel like learning. It's engaging. I could even have them doing much more broader public policy consequences around what the world will look like. If you could just sue people every time a 5-year-old makes a practical joke that goes wrong, versus a world where you were able to pull out chairs on people all the time and get away with it just because you were only 5. So with this said, as a math teacher, Can I set up my problem? So instead of just doing a math problem, I can say, hey, here's two that are both wrong. Which one is more right? I could do this with two science experiments. Which experiment, they both have flaws in their procedure, in their design. Which one is more likely to lead to valid results? These two paragraphs are both kind of funky in their structure and order. Which one is clearer? Which mistake matters the most? Which historical figure is the most important for this war? Which fairy tale character is the absolute worst, shadiest in the whole thing? So these are all things that we talk about a lot in the Thinking Like a Lawyer book. Even test prep, right? Test prep is nothing but shenanigans and games. Don't believe me? Look at this problem. Brittany made 5 meatloaves, 9 pounds of ground beef. Also 14 hamburgers, 4 pounds of ground beef. Each meatloaf was used the same amount of ground beef, which is close to the amount of ground beef in each meatloaf. Ground beef, meatloaf, and the first choice is 1/2 a pound. Got a 5, I got a 9, 5 9, so like 5 tenths, that's 1/2. Bam, choice A, except it's not choice A. Do you see what they just did? Meatloaf, ground beef. Meatloaf, hamburger, ground beef. And now ground beef, meatloaf. Y'all switch the order. It's not 1/2, it's 2/1. Y'all are messing with me. But if I know that these tests are unfair and unjust, I can leverage that to get my kids more excited about going through this process because they do this all the time. All of these questions have these tricks in them, and I gotta have my kids get there. pH is not a sexy topic. I'm sorry, science teachers. pH, nobody cares about pH. But pH hits a little bit different when we're talking about the water crisis in Flint, Michigan. When we start showing pictures of those pipes. When we use the announcement that the mayor made to the citizens of Flint, but switch it up so it's the principal instead making that announcement, talking about your school. If you look at this picture, it's a really funny one. This is the class of remedial kids. These are the low kids taking summer classes. This kid is out of his seat. This girl right here isn't paying attention. Why? Because she's trying to tear apart this new patch of pH sticks because pH has now become super important. You know why? They're measuring water around their school. They're measuring the pH of water in the water fountain, in the sink, in the little puddle lake area that's right outside of their school. Okay? So like as we start piecing this together, we start thinking about ways that our kids can be the change they want to be. We think about ways that we can call out the game the way it is. Like, look, you can say college isn't for everyone, or you can look at the reality. It pays to go to college. It pays to go to college. And I have an article about this. Like, you can actually look at $1.00 investment. As long as you can get it paid for in a way that's not going to put you in massive debt, it's going to literally pay for you to go and get your college degree. A lot of you feel like not doing something. Great. But I'm going to tell you there's a game to be played. And I want you to talk to you about the game. And I talked about this a lot on Monday. There's a performance that's going on. If we're going to act like it's not a performance, then we are lying to our children. I lie to kids all the time, but not about this, okay? I lie to kids all the time, but not about stuff like this. So when we start thinking through this idea around like the performance means that your language is not inappropriate. We're not going to say that, right? It's not a matter of like better, or it's more of like, you know what? Like, I got to figure out like, how am I going to make this transaction work? Because I got to perform this in this situation for these people. And at some point, I'm going to be able to get to a space where I'm much more in a space where I can just be me. And it's just part of the way of playing the game. But it is a game. Part of the game is teaching the hidden curriculum. You know what? It's not okay. And I want to change the system. And I want you to change the system. But today, it is still unfortunately true that we got to work twice as hard to get half as far. Last time I checked, you don't have an Aunt Becky, do you? Nobody's going to lie and say that you were on a crew team, right? So, like, if you don't have a Felicity Huffman or Aunt Becky in your life, like, you better recognize merit isn't everything. How do you network? How do you level up? Do you know who graduated from your high school? Who's prominent? Who's doing big things in your community or in our world? Can you know them? Should you know them? Should you as an educator help your kids connect with alums from our high schools from their local areas so that they can build their power, they can build up their network, so they can have their own version of an Aunt Becky in a hot place? They exist. They're probably not a massively big group, but they'll probably love to hear from a kid that's going to their high school that has a lot of potential to help them set that stage for excellence. So with this all said, this is a big topic on Monday. Our kids are already there. We just need to figure out a way to unleash it. We're going to call out the price of success. We're going to make sure that we understand that we can do this. We know the root causes around cultural, psychological, and social needs. We can do this. So with this being said, I do want to leave some space because we're here at the end for questions, comments, concerns. I know that I'm sorry for the technical difficulty earlier, but would love, love, love any questions that you all have around the topics that we talked about today. I'm all here sweating right now. I'm super, super psyched, man. So like, come bring it on. What do you all have? What are your questions? And if you want to unmute yourself and say your question, even better. You know what? I'm going to stop sharing so I can maybe see all your faces on here without looking all awkward. But yeah, what are your questions? Questions, comments, concerns? Where are we at? How do you get buy-in? Christina, when you say buy-in, buy-in from kids? Buy-in from staff? From teachers? So like when it comes to this, I feel like it's all about connecting it to what matters. When I started Think Law, nobody cares about critical thinking. Nobody was Googling, how do I teach critical thinking? What do they care about? Do they care about test scores? Well, I see the Kentucky assessment. It's hard. It's really tricky. There's no way that kids are going to be successful on that assessment without critical thinking. So you connect it to that. Do they care about classroom culture and student behavior? Great. There's a whole angle in our book that talks about critical thinking as a classroom management strategy. That may be doing that whole I do, we do, you do. That's not in the Bible. You don't have to do it in that structure every single time. Like you can switch it up, you can break it up, you can flip it so that kids can engage and experience. So like there's so many things that we can do to connect it. So what I would tell you, Christina, is think about where their problem is and communicate the importance of these strategies in a way that connects to their problem. Whether it's SEL problem, a test score problem, any problem that they have, we can find a way to connect it to critical thinking. Any other questions, thoughts, concerns?
I have a question. I'm the counselor at my school. And at my school, last year, we identified 29 of our third graders going into fourth grade as advanced program. And I test kids third grade, and then I go back and test again fourth and fifth grade. Because I feel like third grade, when you test in October, you're just an old second grader. So I always go to the higher grade. But my question is, once students are identified, how can I motivate teachers to recognize students that are leaders and students that are critical thinkers? I have one student in a classroom a couple years ago. He was a fifth grader, and we were a pilot for the Gifted Leadership Program. So the teachers didn't want to complete the forms for the Gifted Leadership Program. So I started completing the forms myself and just kind of getting the teachers to buy in while I filled out the form. But there was one student in particular that I recommended for a Gifted Leadership. And he was already advanced program. He had a 27 raw score. And his teacher stood at the door and told me that he was lazy. And that's not that child. The child wasn't lazy. The teacher was lazy. So what kind of conversations can I have?
So I'm
gonna nothing against teachers.
I'm gonna give you a very practical piece of advice.
Okay.
Do I sound crazy?
No.
No, I think because you're if you can mute yourself, I think maybe there's some echo or something. But here's what I noticed. If you tell your teachers in advance, you know what? Go ahead and refer. Like I also want to keep track because I work very closely with special education and behavior departments and ELO departments. Go ahead and also make sure you refer anyone who is literally a pain in your ass. Who are the biggest pains in your classroom? And I want to make sure that you put them on my list as well. Because so often, that's the kid who no teacher is ever going to put on that list. But in so many ways, a lot of the creativity that it takes to be a particular sort of pain, that's gifted to the max. All right. And we've got to make sure that we get there. So that's the number one thing. And like, I think we got to kind of meet people where they are, and we've got to do a really good job of educating our parents on this stuff too. Honestly, a system based off of parent and teaching referrals are always a little bit flawed. Always. Just built in. That's always gonna be a little bit flawed. So you got to figure out all the different ways that you can start to leverage that in different ways. Jamila had a really good question around changing the term low SES. Like, I'm not gonna lie to you. I'm kind of a fan of the term like poor, right? Like I grew up poor. It just is what it is. It's a fact. It is not something like being in poverty. It is not a disease. Being in poverty was not a personal choice. Being in poverty wasn't an issue of personal responsibility any more than somebody that's born into random wealth through a trust fund is an act of personal responsibility. It's what it is. So I like to call things what they are, because in a lot of ways, I look at poverty as a tremendous asset. I look at poverty as like, you know what? Knowing what it means for your whole entire life to optimize constraints, to have to prioritize consistently, to have to collaborate with others to get things that you need. That's kind of the leader that I want to see elevated. I don't think it's a coincidence that we have so many people that are leading amazing work across the world in business, industry, and politics that have this like rags from riches sort of trajectory. There's something about like how you live life when you know that you're part of that struggle that becomes a part of that because not despite story. So like low SES sounds worse than poor for some reason. Like low social, like who the hell are you to tell me what I am is low, right? But like I get what you're saying and I'm with it. So we talk a lot here. I like this idea here around cultural relevance. I need to understand what they're teaching. Why are we doing this? If it's relevant, how can I change it? I want to push back a little bit on that too, though, Mary. Not everything in life is relevant, right? Like not everything is always going to be super interesting. I taught like middle school and high school math. The quadratic formula is what it is. It ain't that sexy. But what I like to do is talk about the game. So a lot of times I'm clear with my kids. I'm like, let me tell you something. In our neighborhood, we don't have a lot of kids that are going into highly selective colleges. So like you want to apply and you want to get a scholarship for this college, they need to know that you're worth the investment. One of the ways you show them, one of the ways you do this performance is to say, I'm going to take really hard classes and do well on them. Because what that shows is when stuff gets hard, you won't quit. So they feel more confident that you'll go to their college and actually graduate from their college and be a good return on that investment. So that's part of what that communication needs to look like. I don't want you to get into this idea that every single thing 100% of every day needs to be super engaging or else kids are going to completely opt out. Does life work like that? Absolutely not. So we need to have that sort of realistic conversation where like, everyone has moments in life where they feel like not doing something. The difference between people that are super successful and people that are less successful, the people that are super successful, they find a way to do it anyway. How do we make sure that we give our kids the tenacity to do the things they don't really feel like doing because it's part of the performance? Let's just call it what it is. It's part of the performance. All right. I know we're about 10 minutes over time, but I really, really do appreciate you all. I'm really excited to be a part of this community with you all. Please do follow on Twitter, follow along. I appreciate the applause. Folks that are inspired by the message. Please do keep in touch. Jennifer, anything you want to say as we close up and wrap up about how, next steps for the conference? Because it seems like it's been an incredible event.
Hold on, I've got two things going. No, I just am so thankful for all the turnout. Can everybody hear me? First of all, nod, maybe give me some yes. And we're going to keep this in mind, and I've gotten feedback. And so hopefully through more contacts now, your GT leads, your counselors can help. You can email me. We're getting the word out, and it excites me as much as it excites Colin, and I can feel your all's energy through this computer. So it's really exciting. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll hang out for a little bit just in case anyone had any additional questions. I'll just be hanging out for a little bit. Somebody's asking Jennifer, how do they get the books? When do they get the books?
Okay, can you all hear me? Okay. I'm not going to explain why I have to ask it. Okay. So the books we have to run through Pony and all the COVID things. I think they're in the order of being processed. We've ordered them, and JCPS doesn't move very quickly. So just be patient. I'm anticipating August before we can get them sent out. Hopefully the Pony starts up. I don't know anything about that. So unfortunately, I don't have a lot of answers, but we have every registered guest logged in, and your books are coming, let's hope, sometime in the fall.
So I don't have to buy the book because I just purchased it off of Amazon.
What'd you say?
So I don't have to buy the book because I just purchased it off Amazon.
Well, you're going to get an extra copy.
You can gift the knowledge. Everyone needs to have this, you know? Give it to your friend from way back when, you know, just like surprise somebody for the summer. Yeah.
I'm sorry, LaTanya.
That's okay. I just purchased it. I mean, off Amazon as you all were asking questions.
Oh, you're going to love it. So you're going to get ahead of everybody else.
All right. Any other questions, comments? All right. So my email is colin@thinklaw.us. If any of you all have questions, I'll just drop it in here so you all have it. Thank you all so much for the opportunity. And just let me know what else you all need from me, Jennifer, as we continue our rollout of what we're doing together for the year. All right.
Thank you. I certainly will.
All right. You take care.
Okay. You too.